Welcome to Lecture 7, Attitudes and Behavior. Introduction. In this lecture, we shall attempt to consider the relationship between attitudes and behavior. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to discuss the relationship between attitudes and behavior. The relationship between attitudes and behavior. Once we've established people's attitudes, can we then accurately predict how they will behave? Rosenberg and Hovland's 1960 three-component model, the ABC model, affective, behavioral, cognitive, implies that the behavioral component will be highly correlated with the cognitive and affective component. An early study which shows the inconsistency of attitudes and behavior is that of Lapierre, 1934. Lapierre's study. Beginning in 1930, and for the next 2 years, Lapierre traveled around the USA with a Chinese couple, a young student and his wife, expecting to encounter anti-Oriental attitudes, which would make it difficult for them to find accommodation. But in the course of 100,000 miles of travel, they were discriminated against only once, and there appeared to be no prejudice. They were given accommodation in 66 hotels, autocamps, and tourist homes, and refused at only one. However, when each of the 251 establishments visited was sent a letter 6 months later asking, "Will you accept members of the Chinese race as guests in your establishment?" 91% of the 128 which responded gave an emphatic no. One establishment gave an unqualified yes, and the rest said undecided, depends upon circumstances. It's generally agreed that attitudes form only one determinant of behavior. They represent predispositions to behave in particular ways, but how we actually act in a particular situation will depend on the immediate consequences of our behavior. How we think others will evaluate our actions and habitual ways of behaving in these kinds of situations. In addition, there may be specific situational factors influencing behavior. For example, in the Lapierre study, the high quality of his Chinese friend's clothes and luggage and their politeness together with the presence of Lapierre himself may have made it more difficult to show overt prejudice. Compatibility between attitudes and behavior. The same attitude may be expressed in a variety of ways. For example, having a positive attitude towards a particular political party doesn't necessarily mean that you will become a member or that you attend public meetings. But if you don't vote the party in a general election, people may question your attitude. In other words, an attitude should predict behavior to some extent, even if this is extremely limited and specific. Indeed, Asgen and Fishbein 1977 argue that attitudes can predict behavior, provided that both are accessed at the same level of generality. There needs to be a high degree of compatibility or correspondence between them. They argue that much of the earlier research, Lapierre's study included, suffered from either trying to predict specific behaviors from general attitudes or vice versa, and this accounts for the generally low correlations. A study by Davidson and Jacquard 1979 tried to overcome this limitation. Attitudes can predict behavior if you ask the right questions. Davidson and Jacquard analyzed correlations between married women's attitudes towards birth control and their actual use of oral contraceptives during the 2 years following the study. When attitude towards birth control was used as the attitude measure, the correlation was 0.08. Clearly, the correspondence here was very low, but when attitudes towards oral contraceptives were measured, the correlation rose to 0.32, and when attitudes towards using oral contraceptives were measured, the correlation rose still further to 0.53. Finally, when attitudes towards using oral contraceptives during the next 3 years was used, it rose still further to 0.57. Clearly, in the last 3 cases, correspondence was much higher. According to Adrian and Fishbein, every single instance of behavior involves 4 specific elements: a specific action, performed with respect to a given target, in a given context, at a given point in time. According to the principle of compatibility, measures of attitude and behavior are compatible to the extent that the target, action, context, and time elements are accessed at identical levels of generality or specificity. For example, a person's attitude towards a healthy lifestyle only specifies the target, leaving the other 3 unspecified. A behavioral measure that would be compatible with this global attitude would have to aggregate a wide range of health behavior across different contexts and texts. Bain, 2000. The reliability and consistency of behavior. Many of the classic studies which failed to find an attitude-behavior relationship accessed just single instances of behavior. As we noted earlier when discussing the Lapierre study, behavior depends on many factors in addition to the attitude. This makes a single instance of behavior an unreliable indicator of an attitude. Jones et al., 1995. Only by sampling many instances of the behavior will the influence of specific factors cancel out. This aggregation principle, Fishbein and Asher, 1974, has been demonstrated in a number of studies. According to Hogg and Vaughan, 1995, what has emerged in the 1980s and 1990s is a view that attitudes and overt behavior aren't related in a simple one-to-one fashion. In order to predict someone's behavior, it must be possible to account for the interaction between attitudes, beliefs, and behavioral intentions, as well as how all of these connect with the latter action. One attempt to formalize these links is a theory of reasoned action, TRA, Adrian and Fishbein, 1970, Fishbein and Adrian, 1975. The strength of attitudes. Most modern theories agree that attitudes are represented in memory, and that an attitude's accessibility can exert a strong influence on behavior. Fazio, 1986. By definition, strong attitudes exert more influence over behavior because they can be automatically activated. One factor that seems to be important is direct experience. For example, Fazio and Sana, 1978, found that measures of students' attitudes towards psychology experiments were better predictors of their future participation if they'd already taken part in several experiments than if they'd only read about them. This can be explained by the mere exposure effect, Zajong, 1968, according to which the more contact we have with something or somebody, the more we like them. So attitudes don't predict behavior. What's the problem? The so-called attitude-behavior problem, that is, a failure to find a reliable relationship between attitudes and behavior, threatened to undermine the entire study of attitudes. As we saw in the introduction and overview, attitude research was a cornerstone of social psychology in general and social cognition in particular for much of their history, stating Rogers et al., 1995. But from the perspective of discursive psychology, there is no reason to expect such a correlation. Inconsistency between attitudes and behavior is what we'd expect to find. Traditional mainstream attitude research is based on the fallacy of individualism, according to which attitudes belong to individuals. This implies something fairly constant and which is expressed and reflected in behavior. From a discursive perspective, attitudes are versions of the world that are constructed by people in the course of their interactions with others, stating Rogers et al., 1995. The strength of attitudes. Discursive psychology is concerned with action as distinct from cognition. In saying or writing things, people are performing actions whose nature can be revealed through a detailed study of the discourse. For example, recordings of everyday conversations, newspaper articles, TV programs. Social psychologists have underestimated the centrality of conflict in social life. An analysis of rhetoric highlights the point that people's versions of events and their own mental life are part of ongoing arguments, debates, and dialogues. Billig, 1987-1992, in Porter, 1996. Compared with traditional attitude research, discursive psychology tries to shift the focus away from single isolated individuals towards interactions between individuals and groups, a more relational or distributed focus. Porter, 1996. Summary: the students have learnt the following. Attitudes could predict behavior if the right questions are asked. End of lecture 7. Thanks for listening.